I was sitting in a crowded izakaya in Shimbashi last week, the kind of place where the air is just thick with cigarette smoke and the exhausted sighs of salarymen. And I ran into an old university friend. Let's call him Sato. A few years ago, Sato was the absolute golden boy at one of Japan's top trading houses. I mean, he was the kind of guy who wore the perfect navy suit and just seemed destined for a comfortable 40-year climb up the corporate ladder. But sitting across from me now, Sato looked completely different. He was wearing a casual linen shirt, looking tanned and, well, remarkably rested. When I asked him how the lifetime employment dream was treating him, he just laughed. It was this sharp, slightly cynical sound. He told me he'd quit a year ago. He hadn't moved to a competitor. He'd moved to Singapore to work for a tech firm. I'm doing the exact same work, he told me, leaning in as he showed me this banking app on his phone. But my salary tripled overnight. In Tokyo, I was being paid for my potential and my loyalty. In Singapore, I'm being paid for my value. He spoke about his old life with this strange mixture of affection and pity, like a man describing a prison he'd finally managed to tunnel out of. He called his old salary a seniority tax, a portion of his productivity that was just being skimmed off to pay for the older guys who sat at their desks reading newspapers. To him, the legendary Japanese stability wasn't a safety net anymore, it was a ceiling. What struck me wasn't just his new wealth, but his total lack of guilt. In traditional Japanese corporate culture, leaving like this is, it's seen as a betrayal. But Sato didn't feel like a traitor. He felt like an arbitrager. He realized that as long as he stayed inside the Galapagos economy of Japan, he was an undervalued asset. By simply moving his physical body a few thousand miles away, he'd unlocked a dual-track reality that his former colleagues couldn't even imagine. As I watched him navigate the evening with this new, detached confidence, I realized Sato wasn't an outlier. He's part of a growing, silent exodus of Japan's transnational elite professionals who have figured out how to play a high-stakes game of economic arbitrage against their own heritage. And it really made me wonder, what happens to a nation when its brightest minds decide that the only way to win the game is to stop playing by the rules entirely?
Wow, that story, that experience with Sato, it perfectly frames this huge structural shift we need to investigate today. We are diving into this strategic decision of Japanese high-net-worth professionals to move away from that rigid structure of traditional employment. They're moving to what's being called self-initiated expatriation, or SIE. And this isn't just, seeking better weather. It's a calculated high-leverage move to bypass domestic wage stagnation by leveraging these transnational career advantages.
So what you're saying is we're basically confirming the formal existence of a dual-track salary system in modern Japan. There's the domestic lane, governed by all the historical corporate rules and loyalty, and then there's this global lane, a lane where Japanese talent can achieve this, accelerated wealth based purely on their market value. So our deep dive today is really to understand the mechanisms behind this dual reality.
Absolutely. Our mission is to investigate the economic pressures that are anchoring the domestic system, the sociological capital that's required to even access the global track, and of course the crucial national implications of this widening fissure. We're effectively charting the emergence of a new class of globally mobile Japanese workers, these modern career ronin, who are separating themselves from the vast domestic workforce that remains constrained by what some of our sources describe as corporate feudalism.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The economic anchor that made someone like your friend Sato feel like he had to, seek exile. We have to set the context of Japan's 3 lost decades following the early 1990s bubble burst. This is a story not of a momentary recession, but of, sustained multi-generational wage stagnation.
It's so crucial to understand the duration and the severity of the stagnation because it fundamentally eroded the social contract between workers and corporations. The best way to illustrate this is through comparative data. If you look at OECD figures, Japan's average annual wage, and this is adjusted for purchasing power parity, it has been stuck at approximately $47,500 since the 1990s. So while other developed nations were seeing constant, steady increases in real wages, Japan just remained stubbornly flat all through the 2000s and 2010s.
So that means for an entire generation, the people who are now the middle-aged workforce, they entered the system expecting that steady climb their parents enjoyed, only to find the escalator was, for all intents and purposes, completely shut off.
Precisely. And the widening gap is just stunning. The average OECD wage has risen significantly, which means the economic penalty for staying in the domestic Japanese market has just steadily grown over 30 years. But maybe the most stinging point of comparison comes from East Asia itself.
You're talking about South Korea.
Yes. South Korea's real average wage has consistently increased, and, get this, since 2019, It has actually surpassed Japan's average wage. This is a massive symbolic and structural shift. It signals that Japan is no longer the undisputed economic powerhouse in the region, at least not when it comes to worker compensation.
So what are the domestic consequences of this 30-year stagnation on the labor pool? I mean, it's not just about the numbers on a chart, it's about how it shattered the expectations of new people entering the workforce.
Right. The initial impact was really felt by young people. Because these core firms were so constrained on personnel costs, they started replacing regular full-time employment opportunities, the ones that come with lifetime guarantees and seniority pay, with low-wage, non-regular employment. These non-regular workers often had significantly fewer benefits, no long-term security, and virtually no meaningful career progression. Over time, this dual-track employment system, which, it started as a flexibility measure for firms, has become the norm for many. And it's not just affecting the youth anymore. We are now seeing it gradually affect middle-aged workers whose traditional security is also being chipped away.
The stagnation, it forces us to look really closely at the bedrock of the Japanese system, the famed 3 pillars of traditional employment. To understand the frustration of the Sato generation, we have to grasp what they were promised in the first place.
The traditional Japanese employment model, especially in large established companies, was built on a deeply legitimate system. The first pillar was lifetime employment guarantees, or shushin koyu. The second, and this is the most relevant to Sato's story, was steep automatic salary increases based on seniority, Nenku Juretsu. And the third pillar was the existence of enterprise unions that traditionally collaborated with management to maintain harmony and stability.
Let's really hone in on that seniority system, because that's where the economic and psychological contract really lives. This is Sato's seniority tax.
The seniority-based system is essentially a contract that spans 4 decades. The key insight here is that it is not a meritocracy, but a deferred compensation system. In their 20s and 30s, young, highly productive workers were intentionally paid less than their output warranted. That right there is the seniority tax. They are subsidizing the older generation. The implicit promise was that this tax would pay dividends later. In their 50s and 60s, they would be paid wages that significantly exceeded their current productivity.
It's like a massive internal loan system.
Precisely. But this entire structure is contingent on 2 critical factors. First, the company must guarantee lifetime employment so the worker stays long enough to collect the deferred compensation. And second, the economy must be growing robustly enough to fund the ballooning payroll costs of a senior workforce. When the economy flatlines and the population ages, the system becomes functionally bankrupt for the younger workers. They're paying the tax now, with less and less confidence that the future payout will ever materialize. This erosion of trust is a huge psychological cost and a primary driver for people like Sato to leave.
And that system worked beautifully when Japan had that rapid post-war expansion and a young demographic pyramid. But now, the aging population must be the single greatest threat to Nenku Juretsu.
It is the existential threat. Several powerful forces have mounted pressure since the 1990s. First, you have intensified global competition and deregulation, which forced firms, particularly those competing internationally, to dramatically cut costs. Second, the aging of Japan's population means the proportion of high-wage, low-productivity older workers is rapidly increasing, making the seniority system fiscally unsustainable for corporations. This demographic reality is just a heavy anchor. And finally, the rise of the service sector, which is less dependent on that collective identity of large manufacturing firms, naturally increased labor mobility, further chipping away at the lifetime commitment premise.
And yet, even with these overwhelming external pressures, Japanese corporate culture has resisted, outright abolishing the traditional contract. They seem to have achieved flexibility through subtle internal maneuvering, sort of bending the rules rather than breaking them.
That resistance is so crucial. Management, they're constrained by powerful enterprise unions and these deeply ingrained public expectations of corporate paternalism. So they've been phasing in change at a glacial pace. They needed mechanisms to control costs and staff levels without triggering a public legitimacy crisis.
What were the key institutional mechanisms they used to get that staffing flexibility without just resorting to mass layoffs?
Well, the most famous mechanism is shuko. This is the transfer of excess regular employees from the main dominant firm to affiliated companies, suppliers, or partners within the sprawling Juretsu network of interlocking firms. From the core company's perspective, they're upholding the lifetime employment guarantee. But for the worker who gets transferred, it almost always results in an economic loss. lower wages, reduced benefits, often a perceived career downgrade, since compensation is so intrinsically tied to the size and prestige of the employer.
So the worker keeps their job, their stability, but they pay a different kind of hidden tax for that privilege.
Exactly. And due to the deeply hierarchical and consensual nature of the Juretsu structure, this transfer is almost universally accepted, despite the economic hit. It sometimes forces the recipient firms to take on employees who might be past their prime or lack the precise skills needed, but it maintains that crucial social fabric of the core enterprise. Alongside Shuko, we saw the aggressive use of early retirement programs, often gently but firmly enforced via the tap on the shoulder, designed to encourage the Midori Wazoku, the sitting by the window tribe, to leave. These were employees who had effectively plateaued and were being overpaid relative to their contribution.
This slow-motion evolution seems aimed almost entirely at cost containment for older workers, but what about the promise to high-performing younger workers? That's where the focus shifted to seikashugi, or performance-based pay. But how successful has that shift actually been?
The concept of seikashugi performanceism gained significant institutional momentum in the late 1990s. It was aggressively championed by business lobbies like Kidanren, the Japan Business Federation, who saw it as the primary way to reduce reliance on age-based pay and, well, rationalize personnel costs. The goal was to link compensation more directly to measurable output or job function.
But our sources suggest this was mostly a buzzword for the majority of the workforce. It didn't really trickle down.
That is the critical distinction. The actual changes have been far from radical for most rank-and-file employees. The biggest structural changes occurred among the managerial class in large firms. For managers, regular seniority pay raises were often abolished, and the historical skill and ability pay system, shokunshi, was reduced or replaced with role or job pay, yakuoriki.
Can you just illustrate that shift between shokunshu and yakurikyu? How does that look on a payroll slip to make it concrete?
Of course. Think of it this way. Under the old skill-based system, shokunshi, if Sato acquired a new certification or skill, his value and his pay would increase based on his individual competence, regardless of his current role. The firm was rewarding his long-term potential. Under the new role-based system, yakuariki, the pay is tied strictly to the job chair he occupies.
So if Sato is an incredibly skilled section chief, but the company only budgets for a section chief salary, he just hits a wall.
Exactly. The company defines the chair, sets the market price for that chair, and that is his ceiling, regardless of how much value he personally generates. This allows the firm to cap costs more effectively. And while this shift did increase wage dispersion for highly educated middle-aged men in large firms, that managerial cohort, for the average employee, seniority and skill grading still play substantial roles. Most companies are still reluctant to implement pure, short-term individual output metrics, preferring to focus on team contribution and long-term potential. And this results in only incremental changes to the overall labor contract.
Which perfectly explains Sato's feeling of being an undervalued asset. The system has incrementally changed just enough to remove the guaranteed security, but not enough to provide the reward structure he needs. This stagnation created the perfect impetus for the exodus.
And now we shift to the solution that this elite workforce has discovered. We really need to define the new players, which are the self-initiated expatriates, the SIEs.
They're the opposite of the traditional Japanese SIE, the corporate expatriate.
Precisely. SIEs are workers who actively, voluntarily find jobs in a destination country outside of their company's internal transfer system. They are seeking better socioeconomic opportunities. This contrasts sharply with corporate expatriates, or CEs, who are company dispatched on controlled assignments, usually with guaranteed return paths and substantial benefit packages. The SIE population is rapidly growing, and it typically comprises younger and middle-aged professionals with high education levels. They're effectively seeking a global second chance for careers that have stalled at home.
The central hypothesis here, then, is that a career that is stuck in Japan suddenly gains immediate global liquidity the moment it crosses a border. This is the definition of the arbitrage game, and the data we have is incredibly supportive of this.
The empirical evidence tracking the earnings growth of Japanese expatriates versus domestic workers between 2020 and 2022 is, well, it's decisive. It confirms this vast arbitrage opportunity.
Give us the numbers again, because they are just staggering.
Okay, so Japanese expatriates across all types, SIEs and CEs, experienced approximately 6% annual earnings growth during this period. Some of the baseline models even suggest figures higher than that, up to 8% per year.
Wait, 6% annual growth? In a period when the global economy was dealing with massive volatility and supply chain issues, these professionals were seeing their income compound at a rate that fundamentally changes their lifetime wealth trajectory.
Now compare that to the domestic reality. Domestic Japanese workers' earnings remained virtually stagnant, showing a paltry annual growth of around 1% over the exact same period. This difference, a six-fold advantage, persisted even when sophisticated statistical models controlled for all the usual variables: age, gender, education level, job factors. For the domestic cohort, growth is almost entirely explained by the slow crawl of seniority. For the mobile elite, growth is driven by market opportunity and the recognition of their immediate value. This is the clearest statistical proof of the dual-track system.
But the data also noted a key complexity here. While the rate of growth was similar for all expatriates, the level of their earnings varied significantly. Moving abroad isn't a one-size-fits-all golden ticket.
That heterogeneity is vital for you to understand. We see a clear earnings hierarchy. Predictably, corporate expatriates, SIEs, were often senior managers receiving extensive hardship and housing allowances at the highest earnings overall. But among the SIEs, there's a stark difference.
Tell us about the two SIE camps.
The first camp, these are SIEs working for multinational companies, so non-Japanese owned. They earn substantially more than their domestic peers. They are truly leveraging international market rates. The second camp, SIEs working for Japanese-owned companies overseas, had earnings levels that were comparable to domestic workers.
That is a critical finding. It means if Sato goes to Singapore and gets hired by a Japanese bank subsidiary, he might get the same growth rate as the globally mobile group, but his absolute salary is still being constrained by a Japanese stratification system. Even if he's physically abroad, he hasn't truly escaped the Galapagos structure.
Exactly. This heterogeneity shows that different forms of capital are at work and receiving different premiums. SIEs and multinational firms are leveraging pure professional skills valued globally: engineering talent, coding expertise, financial modeling. They are paid against international benchmarks.
Whereas the SIEs and Japanese firms are capitalizing on a uniquely Japanese asset.
They're benefiting from what you could call the Japanese premium. Their primary value is their cultural fluency, their linguistic ability, and their deep understanding of the Japanese corporate mindset. They act as essential cultural interpreters between the high-level Japanese SIEs and the local staff. Their job often exists because local employees, while talented, may lack the Japanese language proficiency or cultural understanding required to navigate the often complex Japanese supply chain and reporting structures.
So the demand for the SIE is structural then. Japanese firms overseas are trying to localize to cut the astronomical cost of dispatching SIEs, but they're also deeply reluctant to fully localize management. It creates what some sources call the rice paper ceiling for local talent.
That organizational conflict is pervasive. Japanese headquarters resist localization at the managerial level because they fear a loss of corporate culture or control or quality. The SIE fills this compromise role perfectly. They are hired locally, so they cost less than a highly compensated SIE, but they possess the cultural habitus necessary to maintain the Japanese style of management, to serve as a trusted liaison, and to ensure smooth communication with headquarters and the wider Japanese network in the region. Their Japaneseness commands a specific premium that isolates job opportunities exclusively for them in regions with strong Japanese supply chain presences, making them a strategic middle management stopgap.
So we've established the economic mechanism. The arbitrage opportunity is very real. But this isn't a free-for-all. Only certain people can actually execute this move, which brings us to the sociological barrier. The opportunity for this self-initiated exile is deeply unequal.
And this is where we shift from the balance sheet to the biography. Transnational career mobility isn't just about economics. It's the ultimate mechanism for converting accumulated cultural and social capital into superior economic capital. We have to understand the entry ticket here, which is transnational capital.
How do we define transnational capital? Is it just being bilingual? Is that it?
No, it's far more subtle and powerful than that. Transnational capital is the embodied mastery required to navigate multiple, often fundamentally conflicting social contracts. It's the ability to transition seamlessly from the rigid, consensus-driven, long-term planning mindset of a Japanese boardroom to the aggressive, meritocratic, short-term performance environment of, say, a Singaporean or a Silicon Valley tech firm. The successful SIE acquires a new operating system that makes them uniquely valuable across different national fields.
And the education system acts as the primary institutional filter, making access to this capital structurally unequal right from the start.
Absolutely. We see a stark socioeconomic selectivity regarding who acquires this capital early on. Studies confirm that parental socioeconomic status, so parental income and education, is a massive predictor of a child's propensity for global mobility. Children from high SES families are significantly more likely to exhibit a study abroad intent, or SAI, and critically to participate in pre-college study abroad, particularly long-term stays.
So this means the career path Sato chose isn't some spontaneous choice he made in his 30s. It's often the culmination of a deliberate strategy laid out by his parents decades earlier.
It is a critical family strategy for social reproduction. High SES parents transmit cosmopolitanism to their children through embodied cultural capital, their worldview, their inherent comfort with foreign environments. They already possess the social capital, the transnational connections that normalize the idea of living and working abroad, which reduces the perceived risk for the child. And of course, they can afford the exorbitant direct costs, tuition, travel, living expenses, and the massive indirect costs, like the supplementary education needed to compensate for missed curriculum while the child is abroad, ensuring they don't fall behind in Japan's rigorous university entrance system.
And we see this wealth manifesting in strategies like Oyaku-Rigaku.
Oyaku-Rigaku, or parent-child study abroad, is a perfect illustration of this high SES capital conversion. In this scenario, usually the mother moves abroad with the child, often to North America or Europe, to facilitate the child's acquisition of fluency and global competence, all while the father remains in Japan to work and fund this very, very expensive family endeavor. It represents a temporary sacrifice of family structure for the long-term acquisition of an invaluable asset transnational capital that will ensure the child's future advantage, setting them far apart from their peers who lack the financial capacity to pursue such a strategy.
And not all foreign exposure is created equal, right? There's a distinct global hierarchy of academic qualifications that reinforces all this.
That hierarchy is crucial. North American and Western European academic qualifications are institutionally valued globally, and they act as powerful proxies for cosmopolitan competence. This is because the West historically dominated and shaped the current global economic and cultural frameworks. So a degree from an Ivy League or Oxbridge, which is primarily accessible to high SES individuals, provides an institutionalized advantage that is difficult to counter with a domestic Japanese degree, regardless of its prestige within Japan. You are buying a globally recognized stamp of approval.
So once this transnational capital is acquired, the dual-track mindset, the foreign language fluency, the validated global degree, how is it then used to perform this dimensional reduction attack on the Japanese corporate system when the SIE returns home?
When a professional with this asset returns to Japan, they have immense, almost asymmetric leverage. They're not merely asking for a raise. They're presenting an externally validated benchmark of their value that the rigid seniority ladder cannot easily contextualize or dismiss.
They are essentially walking in and saying, the global market values me at $300,000. Your internal scale, which caps me at $100,000, is irrelevant.
Precisely. The Japanese system, rooted in this insular logic, it views external experience as disruptive and nonlinear. Growth is supposed to be linear, internal, and gradual. The returnee stages a dimensional reduction attack by simplifying their value proposition to a market price, forcing the company to react based on utility rather than tradition. If the company needs that specific, globally validated skill set, say, a manager who speaks Japanese perfectly but operates on international accounting standards, they often have no choice but to fold. They create a special dual-track salary and position specifically to accommodate the returnee's superior compensation and status demands, effectively bypassing the entire traditional hierarchy and rewarding their external validation.
This sounds like a powerful narrative of triumph for the mobile elite. But there has always been this pessimistic assumption that even if they succeed abroad, returning to Japan results in a penalty, because the domestic system simply refuses to value external experience. Is that actually true?
This was a primary question of the recent longitudinal research.
Yeah.
The core hypothesis was, does the act of returning to Japan inherently penalize the SIE's job earnings, forcing them back onto the lower domestic track?
And what did this sophisticated analysis reveal once all the variables were isolated?
The multivariate statistical finding largely overturned the traditional pessimistic view. While initial descriptive results did show that SIEs returned to Japanese-owned firms often experienced an apparent earnings decline compared to their overseas peak, the critical finding was the cause. This apparent penalty was largely explained by job characteristics, specifically whether they secured a managerial position, the type of occupation, and working hours and pre-migration conditions.
So, if Sato returned, took a non-managerial, internal-facing role with fewer hours, his pay would drop. But that drop is attributable to the new job's characteristics, not the fact that he was an SIE.
Exactly. Once those compositional differences were accounted for, the types of jobs returnees were actually taking, the act of returning to Japan itself resulted in a statistically insignificant effect on earnings. There was neither an inherent penalty nor a premium. This is a crucial distinction. It means the SIE success is entirely dependent on securing a high-value, specialized position that capitalizes on their transnational capital. They don't face a guaranteed dead end. They face a challenge of placement.
This just confirms the increasing size of the socioeconomic fissure. On one side, we have the class that has found the key to global liquidity, which is the engine for accelerated wealth. And on the other, we have the majority of the workforce bound to the domestic Galapagos economy, facing what you called static economics.
Static economics is the perfect term. Their salaries remain flat, that 1% annual growth we discussed. In a world where the cost of living and inflation are constantly rising, this means diminishing relative returns year after year. For the ambitious and skilled individual, remaining in the domestic lane means actively choosing a managed decline, whereas global mobility offers compounding wealth acceleration. The fundamental stability promised by corporate paternalism has been replaced by a quiet impoverishment relative to global peers.
And the core reason for this fissure persists. Japanese corporations are fundamentally resistant to valuing external experience, which is what would be required to bridge the gap.
That corporate resistance is institutional. Earnings growth is traditionally tied to internal progression and internal seniority. External hires, by definition, disrupt the organizational logic. So while corporations desperately need the specialized talent that SIEs represent, they are simultaneously reluctant to dismantle the stable, predictable, and ultimately cost-controlling structures that maintain internal order. They need the talent, but they don't want to pay the market price because it would require upsetting the entire internal pay structure.
This brings us to the active, ongoing battle over the future of the Japanese labor system, fought by the two institutional behemoths. We have the business lobby, Kaidenren, pushing for radical marketization, and the massive union confederation, Zenroren, fighting to preserve the remnants of corporate paternalism.
The tension here is so intense because it defines the future of the Japanese social contract. Kaidenren, which is Japan's most influential business lobby, representing the largest corporations, has consistently called for reform. In their 2025 report on management and labor policy, they did call for stabilizing wage hikes, recognizing the need for overall structural increases. But they insisted that this must be coupled with fundamental reform of the wage system itself.
And what specifically are they demanding?
Their core demand is to accelerate the shift to job-based employment that Yakuariki we discussed. They want to decouple compensation entirely from age, seniority, and often skill, and tie it strictly to the job function. They explicitly call for reducing or eliminating traditional allowances in age-based pay components. Their strategy is crystal clear. Acquire the specific abilities they need on the market at the lowest possible transactional cost.
They want to make the worker fully responsible for their own career security.
Precisely. Kaidenren frames their push for smooth labor mobility and open job posting systems as empowering the worker's choice. They are advocating for the institutionalization of the SIE mindset domestically, a performance-driven system where workers must continually prove and update their market utility. And what's more, they were pushing for fundamental revisions to labor laws, including studying the creation of systems to allow dismissals through monetary settlement if they are deemed invalid, and seeking clear definitions for when dismissals are acceptable under Article 16 of the Labor Contract Act.
That is essentially an attempt to undermine lifetime employment entirely, replacing stability with transaction.
It is. And Zenroren, the National Confederation of Trade Unions, is fighting this tooth and nail. In their 2025 statement, they strongly oppose the Kaidenren proposals, arguing that promoting smooth labor mobility and job-based employment is selfish and short-sighted.
What's their core counter-argument?
Zenroren sees this shift as an institutional license for companies to throw away workers once their current utility expires. Their entire purpose is rooted in preserving the social responsibility of a large corporation. They insist that the Labor Standards Act must be improved to protect workers, not dismantled to benefit corporate flexibility. They specifically declared that the push to reform working hour regulation to allow discretionary schedules, another key Cadana demand, is absolutely unacceptable. They are fighting to maintain the expectation that loyalty still merits stability.
So the conflict boils down to this. Kaidanran wants the corporate structure to recognize and reward market value, mirroring the global track, while Zanwaran is attempting to prevent the domestic workforce from being completely exposed to that same market volatility, fighting for the remnants of the traditional contract. The fundamental nature of the Japanese labor agreement is fracturing right along this line of global market exposure versus domestic institutional protection.
When we synthesize the findings, the narrative is incredibly powerful. Transnational career mobility has become a high-stakes, highly effective alternative pathway to economic advancement for the Japanese middle class when domestic channels are constrained by chronic wage stagnation and these rigid institutional structures.
We called it the Galapagos arbitrage. The professionals who find a way to bridge the national insulation with the global market, whether by leveraging specialized professional skills in multinational companies or capitalizing on the scarcity value of the Japanese premium within regional Japanese supply chains, they are creating opportunity structures the domestic market just cannot replicate. This is a methodological transnationalism where career advancement is decoupled from the bounded national market.
And the consequence is a profound national stratification. Japan is operating in what you could call a folded era. On one surface, the traditional corporate and political order is ceded to the elders, who are maintaining the facade of the three pillars and gradual reform. But simultaneously, the most ambitious and capable professionals are quietly executing strategic economic arbitrage, capturing opportunities that solidify their position as a mobile elite separated from the static majority.
The cultivation of this transnational professional advantage is, for the ambitious, really the only available self-compensation mechanism against the managed decline of the domestic system. The key takeaway for the professional class is clear. The path to financial success is no longer about patiently climbing the internal ladder perfectly. It is about recognizing that that ladder had become a ceiling, and the only way forward is to find a higher value, globally connected board on which to play.